world.
We are deeply concerned about the situation and that the government persists in its failure to take heed of international and regional calls for an end to the bloodshed.
Close to 4,000 people reported killed in Syria as the crackdown on pro-democracy protests continues. And alarm at the resurgence of mercenaries and the expansion of private military forces.
Employees of Blackwater, a U.S. military contractor, allegedly shot and killed 17 civilians.
Hello and welcome to The World. I'm Tim Stackpool. Thanks for your company. Also in the program, the race against time to get food to the famine-affected areas of Somalia. But first, the number of people killed in Syria since the crackdown on pro-democracy protests began in March this year is on the increase. Security forces have reportedly been using tanks and heavy weapons in residential areas. Frustratingly, an independent commission of inquiry into human rights violations during the unrest has so far failed to gain access to Syria. Claire Dool reports.
After another week of bloodshed, the death toll in the Syrian government's crackdown on dissent has risen to at least 3,500. Spokeswoman for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Ravina Shamdasani.
The brutal crackdown on dissent in Syria has so far claimed the lives of more than 3,500 Syrians. More than 60 people are reported to have been killed by military and security forces since Syria signed the peace plan sponsored by the League of Arab States, including at least 19 on Eid al-Adha on Sunday.
The UN says the death toll is a conservative tally based on credible sources on the ground. It's particularly concerned about the use of tanks and heavy weaponry by government forces on residential areas in the city of Homs.
The situation in the neighborhood of Baba Amro has been particularly appalling. According to information OHCHR receives from residents, the neighborhood has been under siege for 7 days, with residents deprived of food, water, and medical supplies. We are deeply concerned about the situation and that the government persists in its failure to take heed of international and regional calls for an end to the bloodshed.
The UN has no current access to Syria. A UN Independent Commission of Inquiry was mandated by the Human Rights Council in August to investigate human rights violations, but so far Damascus has blocked investigators from entering the country. Spokesman for the Council, Rolando Gomez, says whether or not the investigators get access, they will publish a report.
The report itself will go ahead, regardless of if they have access or not. I understand that the commissioners and their team are in the region. They are in the process of putting together a report now. We're now beginning of November, so a few weeks before they actually piece this report together, and in one way or form it will be presented to the Council.
The human rights situation is certainly deteriorating. Despite the deal struck with the Arab League to halt the violence, there's been no let-up in the killings. Ravina Shamdasani for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights again.
This has been extraordinarily disappointing. There was, as you know, this peace plan by the League of Arab States that the Syrian government had engaged to. But since the peace plan was signed, in fact, there have been further killings, further sieges of towns, and really shocking reports coming out from the ground.
The UN Human Rights Office says it stands by its call made in August for the Security Council to refer the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court.
Claire Dool with that report. 4 countries in the Western Balkan region have agreed to cooperate to end the enduring refugee crisis in southeast Europe. The United Nations Refugee Agency, charged with the protection of refugees around the world, has welcomed the deal, signed by the Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia and Montenegro governments. Richard Hillary in Geneva has more on this story.
A ministerial conference has concluded with the adoption of a joint declaration on ending displacement and finding solutions for refugees and internally displaced persons in Western Balkans. 74,000 refugees remain stateless following the civil war in the region during the early 1990s. Adrian Edwards, spokesperson for UNHCR, says positive steps have been taken towards ending Europe's largest refugee crisis.
It has come about through intense efforts by the 4 countries and is a firm commitment on the part of their respective governments to cooperate at regional and national level in dealing with an enduring problem for this part of Europe. Displacement in the Western Balkans is one of the 5 priority protracted refugee situations worldwide for UNHCR.
UN High Commissioner for Refugees Antonio Guterres attended the meeting in Belgrade and witnessed the signing of a regional programme along with the representatives of the EU, US, OSCE and the Council of Europe. The primary objective of the programme allows refugees to return to their communities quickly and resume their normal lives. Adrian Edwards speaks of its importance for the process.
With more than 2 million people uprooted within and beyond the region, it was the largest refugee crisis in Europe since the Second World War. The majority of the refugees have returned home over the past 16 years or have integrated locally. The work plan sets out concrete steps for removing remaining obstacles.
UNHCR is also working with the national authorities on the development of future asylum systems to ensure refugee returns stay in line with international and European Union standards and allow countries in the region to gain membership of the EU.
UNHCR believes the fulfilment of these commitments will also support the accession of these countries to the European Union. We will remain engaged and strongly committed to supporting the governments of these 4 countries in closing this refugee displacement chapter.
Richard Hillary in Geneva there, reporting on the cooperation between Balkan countries on the refugee crisis in southeast Europe. In today's digital world, new data is being generated by just about everything we do. Calling a friend, making a purchase, using the internet to access information. They all leave a digital trail. A new initiative seeks to analyse such data to get a better understanding of changes in human well-being. Zazie Schaefer, the Deputy Director of the Global Pulse Project, says such information can assist with economic crises or disaster management.
What we believe in the longer term, this project can make a major contribution to making development more agile. We've seen, this environment we are living in at the moment is much more volatile than many years ago. We see many more crises happening, and they're much more contagious than in probably 10 years ago. So we believe that development has to become much more agile, much more responsive. And we believe that Global Pulse and this new data can help us become much more agile.
We have seen many advancements over the past few years. What are some of the technologies that you are working with?
What policymakers need in a crisis situation to protect the most vulnerable populations in their countries is real-time data. It's not so much about the technologies, it's more about how these technologies kind of generate this new type of data.
So how is it, though, that you use this data to solve problems that people face?
What we are really looking at is how policymakers can better protect vulnerable populations when, for example, a global economic crisis hits. Now, one of the main tools that policymakers have are social protection programs. There have been many studies that, for example, mobile phone calling patterns can give you a sense of changes in people's economic status. They can give you a sense of people moving, for example, from urban areas to rural areas or the other way around. So this is very important information for policymakers.
What about the concerns that people have about privacy, about the information you gather, about perhaps the phone calls they make or the other info that you mentioned?
Yeah, one of the key principles of this project is the protection of individuals' privacy and the protection of national sovereignty as well. There's a lot of data that governments cannot share publicly, so it's extremely important to be very sensitive or very attuned to how to use this data. None of the data that this project will be accessing can be traced back to individuals. It will all be aggregated and anonymized data, and that is extremely important.
Zazie Schaefer from the Global Pulse Project there, talking about how aggregated information gained via technology can be used on a national or international scale when a crisis hits. To Somalia now, and the international community currently faces what's been described as a race against time to deliver food to the famine-affected areas of the country. Famine was declared in a number of southern regions in the Horn of Africa country around 100 days ago, but ongoing conflict and the onset of the rainy season has made accessing the most vulnerable people difficult. Mark Bowden is coordinating the humanitarian relief in Somalia. Ari Gaetanis asked him about the current situation.
Somalia is still going through its most critical period in terms of the famine that exists in major parts of the country and very acute food shortages caused by the drought in other parts of the country. So at the moment, Somalia has really two critical elements to the crisis. In Mogadishu, there have been a large number of IDPs, internally displaced persons, flooding into the town, which is putting pressure on services and the capacity to support them. In the famine areas, we're really working in a race against time to get assistance and particularly access to food to the people in crisis in those areas.
been almost 100 days, or a bit more than 100 days, since it was announced or declared a famine in Somalia, parts of Somalia. What's been achieved in those 100 days that have passed so far?
Well, a great deal has been achieved. After a slow start, delays for a number of different reasons, partly because of conflict and other things, that there's been a steady increase in the levels of food that have been going into the famine areas. There has already been quite a lot of work getting the supplementary foodstuffs that are needed. We're now beginning to see the other schemes, such as food voucher schemes and cash schemes, beginning to take place. So I'm very hopeful that during November we will see an even larger increase in the overall levels of assistance in famine-affected areas, but also people's access to that assistance.
We've begun the rainy season. What impact does that have upon operations on the ground, and how are they dealt with those challenges?
Well, the rainy season is important for a number of reasons, because it means that we should be getting a harvest in January, which will make a difference to the overall food situation. So one of the major challenges of the rainy season is to get seeds into place in the main growing areas. That's started to happen. In fact, I understand that the main seed distribution has taken place from FAO, that other organisations are still moving on seed distribution. And what we need to ensure now is that there are people who will undertake the planting and invest their labour in the situation. But the rains also bring bad news in that they bring problems in terms of disease. Communicable diseases are increasing. The major risk is malaria, for example, which in the 1992 crisis was the big killer. So there are two challenges. One is ensuring that we preserve people's assets and livelihoods during this famine, and the second is that we help protect them from the massive risk of communicable diseases that occurs during the rainy season.
Speaking of challenges, how does the conflict on the ground also play into that?
I think conflict always affects people. It affects people in terms of the fact that Somalia has had more civilians killed than probably any other conflict. The civilians have borne the major brunt of the conflict, and that's a clear problem. The second element of conflict that takes place is that it usually makes it more difficult for humanitarian organisations to work. There are more restrictions on their movement. Everybody's suspicious of what's going on, what's happening, and therefore the capability, the capacity for people to respond effectively is considerably diminished. And then thirdly, there are potential problems in terms of disrupting the supply lines of food into famine areas. So those are the sort of three big challenges that exist. And the more prolonged the conflict is, the worse the impact will be on people.
Mark Bowden in Somalia, ending that report by Ari Gaetanis. The Palestinians' bid for recognition as a state by the United Nations has been described as risky and confrontational by the French government. Palestine applied for full membership to the UN in September, but the United States has said that it will use its veto in the UN Security Council to block the move. Now, the French have said they will abstain from the vote because the bid has no chance of success. The US says Palestine and Israel need to come to a negotiated settlement on peace in the region and on the question of statehood. Jerry Adams spoke to Briou Pont, a delegate with France's mission to the UN.
Well, France announced yesterday at the meeting of the Security Council Standing Committee on Admissions that it would have no other option than to abstain on a resolution which would recommend full membership for Palestine. We are all well aware in the international community that the Palestinian request has no chance of success in the Security Council, in particular because of the opposition expressed by one delegation, the United States, which have a power of veto. And on September 21, at the Ministerial Week here in New York, President Sarkozy warned the international community before the United Nations General Assembly of the risks of confrontation and deadlock that such an approach could create.
What other concerns does France have regarding Palestinian statehood at this time?
The reason for this announcement is that France believes that the Security Council track is risky. It is unnecessarily confrontational and counterproductive. We want to avoid the train wreck, and we support a more consensual approach. You know, France was not compelled to announce its position yesterday. It could have very well remained silent. But we wanted to send an early message to our Palestinian friends and tell them that they should choose another track, as the one they have chosen is doomed to failure. So France has assumed its responsibilities by proposing another approach, a realistic solution allowing Palestine's status to be elevated, to be upgraded to that of an observer state at the United Nations, in order to advance Palestine's international existence with a view towards a two-state solution. And we believe it would constitute an additional and remarkable step towards admission. We support the increasing existence of Palestine in international life. This is why, for instance, France supported Palestine's request for admission to UNESCO.
So the relationship between France and Palestine is a good one.
We have an excellent relationship. We are working hard for a global, just, sustainable solution for peace. And in this context, the legitimacy of the Palestinian aspiration for statehood is indisputable for France.
Still at the UN, and a group of experts there are warning about the alarming resurgence in the use of mercenaries, as well as the expansion of private military and security companies globally. The group is calling for the elimination of the use of mercenaries and for the international regulation of outsourcing security services. In Côte d'Ivoire and Libya, mercenaries were reportedly responsible for gross human rights violations. Meanwhile, in Iraq, contractors for military and security companies have also been accused of committing abuses. Or so says Faiza Patel, who heads the UN group. She's speaking with Jocelyn Sambira.
Obviously, Iraq is where, the issue of private military companies really came to the center of international attention, particularly with the 2007 incident in Nusur Square in Baghdad, where employees of Blackwater, a U.S. military contractor, allegedly shot and killed 17 civilians. So in Iraq, we were looking at how the Iraqi government is now dealing with this issue. Until quite recently, 2009, the Coalition Provisional Authority, which ran Iraq, had issued immunity for all military contractors operating there. That was reversed in 2009, but there's still quite a lack of clarity about how the current status is of these contractors. And for any events that happened prior to 2009, it has not been possible for the government to bring any prosecutions in Iraqi courts, and prosecutions in U.S. courts have also been problematic. So the Nusur Square case, which is the most famous incident, is still pending now 4 years after the incident in U.S. courts.
Has there been any improvement in terms of the way these companies behave because of the scrutiny?
Well, in some ways, in particular situations, we have seen that the incidents that happened, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan, have led some countries to tighten their regulations. So the United States government, for example, has significantly tightened its control over contractors. And obviously, if they're better controlled, they're less likely to commit abuses. And this has been particularly true of the Department of Defense contractors. With respect to other contractors hired by the U.S., for example, the Department of State, USAID, there's a number of agencies that use them. The mechanisms for control are not as tight as they are for the Defense Department. In Iraq as well, the country itself has taken charge of the situation, and the Ministry of Interior there has been quite vigilant in looking after contractors. So there's been pockets of improvement, but on an overall basis, there hasn't really been an overall convention or new legislation in a number of countries to control these companies.
What about these states that don't necessarily regulate?
There's a great unevenness in the national legislation on this issue. Many countries don't have legislation on this issue because it's a relatively new phenomena. And you have to also think about the fact that there are at least 3 categories of countries that need legislation. So you need legislation in the country where the company is registered, which is primarily in the US, the UK, Western Europe. That's where most of these countries are headquartered. You need legislation in the countries where these companies operate. So Afghanistan, Iraq has to have its own national legislation. And thirdly, you need legislation in countries like Uganda, where people are recruited from. And you have large contingents of Ugandans working for PMSCs. So you need a lot of legislation, and you don't actually have very much at this point.
So today in New York, what is your main message?
My main message is that when we say mercenary, it sounds almost old-fashioned. something that we think about in the 1970s, but it's very much a real phenomenon today. And when we look at the situation in Côte d'Ivoire and you look at the situation in Libya, you see that, particularly on the African continent, mercenaries are very much an issue. My second message would be that private military and security companies, because of the nature of their activities, continue to pose pretty serious risks to human rights, and so we need to be vigilant and make sure that they're really properly regulated, both at the national level and internationally.
Jocelyn Sambira reporting. The inequities between the rich and the poor, as well as environmental challenges, threaten development in Asia. An annual report which provides rankings of national achievement in health, education and income in 187 countries worldwide indicates that despite progress, many people are still living in poverty in the region. The highest ranking Asian country is Japan, which is 12th, while the lowest is Afghanistan at 172. India is ranked 134. Daniel Dickinson asked Bill Orme, who assisted with developing the ranking, why India, for example, is ranked so low.
Now, we have something called the Multidimensional Poverty Index, which looks at poverty from a different way than just the income, $1.25 a day or less, measure that the Millennium Development Goals that the UN has used, for example. It looks at things objectively like living standards, the kinds of houses people live in, their household possessions, do they have access to clean water, and many other variables. And India has a larger number of multidimensional poor than sub-Saharan Africa. Now, that might seem, somewhat shocking and surprising until you look at the population and the size of India obviously being so great. But India is taking serious policy measures to kind of attack and change that acute poverty in the country.
The Asia region covers a huge number of countries, from Japan, which is number 12 in the index, to Afghanistan, which is 172. Can you get any meaningful data, meaningful messages out of such a broad-based survey?
In a word, no. To generalize about Asia is kind of a fool's game. If you were trying to look for commonalities, it is arguably the most dynamic region in the world. And that is true of not just a few countries, but of most countries in the world. And is dynamic not just in terms of economy, but is dynamic in terms of societal change, political change, cultural change. It's a fast-moving target. That is why, even though the environmental problems are very severe, a lot of people think that it is Asia which will lead the way in coming to terms with these problems globally.
Can poorer parts of the world learn anything from the Asian countries that have done well?
One country that is particularly interesting to us who are in the business of following human development trends is the Republic of Korea. South Korea, when we started our reports 20 years ago in 1990, was a middle-income, emerging, but still developing country. Now it is number 15 in the Human Development Index, and it's in the OECD countries. It is now a donor country, and it is also leading the way in converting the way it produces energy and the way it produces all the manufactured products that it exports to make that much more energy efficient by trying to have what they call a green economy. So the lesson from South Korea is that reducing your carbon footprint does not mean a trade-off for a lower lifestyle. And so in that sense, they really are leading the way technologically and, in a sense, politically as well.
What can a government minister sitting in Pakistan or Nepal do with this report? How useful is it to them?
Governments can decide that they're going to invest in schooling. They can decide that they're going to invest in healthcare. And that is a long-term payoff, and also in income terms over the long run. Income, you're often vulnerable to world economic trends, the value of the commodities you export, foreign investment, competitors, and many of the things that are less in your control. So as a government, if you look at how you're doing in human development terms, as we define it, we think that's actually a more accurate monitor of how you're doing as a society and whether you're delivering as you should to your own citizens.
And finally, some personal health matters, in particular, how 5 lifestyle factors are important when working towards reducing the risk of type 2 diabetes, almost an epidemic in the developed world. Here's Joe Belenfi.
A new analysis of data collected from more than 200,000 adults has found that a combination of 5 healthy lifestyle factors is associated with a reduced risk of developing type 2 diabetes.
The lifestyle factors we were interested in were an optimal body weight, a healthy diet, recommended levels of physical activity, not smoking, and modest alcohol consumption.
Dr. Jared Rees is an epidemiologist at the National Institutes of Health.
Each healthy lifestyle factor was associated with about a 30% lower risk of developing diabetes, and all 5 healthy lifestyle factors combined was associated with about an 80% lower risk.
Dr. Rees adds that the most significant risk factor is weight.
Not being overweight or obese led to the greatest protection. However, we found that overweight or obese adults with a greater number of the other healthy lifestyle factors had a lower risk of developing diabetes. This is good news because it suggests that overweight or obese adults can benefit by adopting other healthy lifestyle behaviors.
Type 2 accounts for 90 to 95% of all diagnosed cases in adults. Diabetes risk factors include being related to someone who has diabetes, but this study also found that while family history is strongly linked to the disease, people may be able to largely prevent or delay the onset by leading a healthy lifestyle. In other words, Rees says, that risk may not be predetermined by genetics. He adds that similar studies to date have focused on the impact of one risk factor at a time, even though most people's lifestyles involve multiple factors.
I would advise people to work toward achieving and maintaining an optimal body weight, adopting healthy physical activity and dietary goals, not smoking, and if you drink alcohol, do so only in moderation.
Age is another major risk factor for type 2 diabetes, but Dr. Rees points out,
our findings really highlight the fact that it's never too late to adopt a healthy lifestyle.
The data for this study were collected as part of the NIH AARP Diet and Health Study. This is Joe Belinfy, Bethesda, Maryland.
And that's the program for this week. If you want to learn more or wish to make a contribution, then please visit us at www.theworldradioshow.com. The World is committed to bringing you stories that affect the people of our planet, either on a mass or individual scale. We hope to do so with balance and integrity. As always, we welcome your comments and your suggestions, so please do keep in touch at www.theworldradioshow.com. The program is produced and compiled by Tim Stackpool, and I look forward to your company next time. Bye for now.